still remember the first time I truly grasped what an American aircraft carrier was. A floating city on the ocean, a beast unlike anything we'd ever imagined back in the Royal Navy. My name's James Carter, and I served in the British Navy during the early days of the Second World War. Like many of my fellow officers, I'd grown up believing that the future of naval warfare lay in battleships and cruisers, those ironclad monsters with guns bigger than a man's arm. Aircraft carriers? Well, we thought of them as nice toys for scouting or minor support roles, a bit like those novelty gadgets you get at a seaside fair, fun, but not something to bet your life on. But the Atlantic Ocean has a way of changing your mind, especially when massive silhouettes loom out of the fog, bigger than anything you expect. It was 1941, and word was trickling back to London from submarine commanders and convoy escorts of these enormous American vessels slicing through the waves. I still chuckle when I think about the first reports. They described ships so vast, it was like a floating airport had been dropped into the middle of the sea. At first, I thought the lads were exaggerating after too many pints, but the pictures and intercepted signals confirmed it. These were no ordinary ships. The Americans had built a new kind of warship, one that wasn't just a hunk of steel and guns, but a city with wings. I got my first close look at one of these giants during a reconnaissance mission near the coast of Cornwall. The carrier loomed, its flight deck stretching longer than a London street, spotless and humming with activity. The crew moved with a rhythm that was part military precision, part mechanical dance. Men in brightly colored uniforms directed planes taxiing and taking off like clockwork, a spectacle that made our own rigid formations seem stiff and outdated. And the planes themselves, dozens of them, lined up in neat rows beneath the flight deck, their sleek forms promising speed and deadly reach. It was not just the size that stunned me, it was the atmosphere on board. Unlike the cramped, steel-tight quarters we endured on our destroyers, this ship had space to breathe. The mess halls were enormous, filled with the smells of fresh coffee and baked bread, not just the usual hardtack and canned stew. I caught a glimpse of the officers' lounges, where men in pressed uniforms relaxed between sorties. One of the stewardesses, a striking woman named Ellen, passed by wearing a tailored navy blue dress that hugged her figure just enough to turn heads without breaking any rules. Her polished leather shoes clicked softly on the deck, and a string of pearls glimmered at her neck, small luxuries on a warship, but symbols of a life sustained even in the chaos of battle. I joked to a mate, if we had a ship like this, I might actually look forward to sea duty. But beneath the jest was a growing unease. The Americans weren't just building big ships. They were inventing a new way to fight. These carriers didn't hide behind the horizon. They ruled it. Their aircraft could scout hundreds of miles ahead, strike enemy submarines before they surfaced, and protect their own fleets with a shield of wings. For us, submarines had been the hunters, slipping unseen beneath the waves. Now we were the hunted. Back in London, the Admiralty was buzzing with reports from the Mediterranean and Pacific theaters. The Battle of Midway had become a case study in naval innovation. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, lost to coordinated American airstrikes launched from these floating airfields. It was a naval battle fought not with giant guns, but with planes unleashed from steel decks that moved with the tides. I recall the grim looks exchanged at the briefing rooms. Our old strategies felt like relics from a bygone era. Even after the war, memories of those floating fortresses lingered with me. The Americans had not just built ships, they had created entire communities at sea, places where thousands of men lived, worked, and fought with a resilience we had struggled to match. Their carriers were a reminder that, in modern warfare, it was not just the size of your guns, but the breadth of your vision and the strength of your industry that determined victory. And yet, as I watched those carriers vanish into the fog after a sortie, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had glimpsed something far more ominous. A new era of naval power that would shape the future of the world's oceans forever. Somewhere in those endless decks and roaring engines, the next chapter of the war was already being written. But what secrets did those floating cities still hold beneath their steel skins? That question would haunt me long after the guns fell silent. The morning fog hung low over Portsmouth Harbor as I stepped aboard HMS Resolute for what was supposed to be a routine briefing. Instead, I found myself swallowed in a story that would change everything I thought I knew about naval warfare. My commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, a man with a sharp jaw and eyes like storm clouds, had just returned from a secret intelligence mission to the United States. His news was anything but routine. "Gentlemen," he began, voice low but steady, "we're not dealing with the same kind of enemy we once imagined. The Americans are building carriers that make our battleships look like rowboats." He paused, letting that sink in. "And these ships, they're not just carriers. They're floating fortresses, mobile airfields with wings that stretch far beyond the horizon." I could see the disbelief flicker across the faces of the officers gathered in the cramped briefing room. We'd all heard rumors, but hearing it straight from a man who'd seen it with his own eyes was something else entirely. Captain Reynolds described the American shipyards massive, humming with activity like factories from a science fiction tale. Essex-class carriers being launched one after another, as if they were as common as fishing boats. He told us about the flight decks, which stretched nearly 3 football fields in length, packed with dozens of aircraft ready to launch at a moment's notice. The hangars beneath the deck were like caverns, filled with technicians and mechanics working tirelessly to keep those planes airworthy. The American crews moved with a precision that was almost hypnotic, colored uniforms directing a ballet of engines, fuel trucks, and armaments. I remember him mentioning the galley. "Imagine feeding 5,000 men 3 times a day without running out of fresh food or coffee," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "They even have ice cream." That got a laugh, though it was tinged with bitterness. Our own rations back home were a far cry from such indulgences. The Americans' attention to morale and comfort was strategic genius disguised as kindness. Then there was the medical bay, a fully equipped hospital, with surgical theaters and wards that made our cramped infirmaries look like afterthoughts. Captain Reynolds said it was a lifeline, turning wounded men around faster than we dared hope. But what unsettled me most was his description of the flight operations. Launching up to 100 aircraft in rapid succession, recovering them with near-perfect precision, refueling and rearming them in record time. It was industrial choreography. He said the Americans trusted their sailors to act on their own initiative, unlike our strict hierarchies that sometimes slowed us down. It was a messy kind of order, but it worked. After the briefing, I found myself wandering the docks, staring out to sea where the silhouettes of our own ships cut dark lines against the horizon. I couldn't help but wonder, could our Navy ever match this scale and efficiency? The answer felt painfully clear. Despite our pride in the Royal Navy, we were playing catch-up in a game that had already changed its rules. That evening, as I sat in the officers' mess nursing a glass of scotch, my mind drifted back to the Americans' floating cities. The contrast was stark. Our cramped quarters, the cold steel walls pressing in like a cage, versus their vast decks where sailors moved with purpose and confidence. I even found myself envying their stewardesses, the way they carried themselves, their uniforms crisp yet flattering, adding a touch of warmth to the cold machinery of war. One of the younger officers joked, "Maybe we should send a carrier-sized care package to the lads across the pond. Some good grub and a few dozen of those stewardesses." The room erupted with laughter, but beneath the humor lay a somber truth. The war had become a battle not just of guns, but of endurance, morale, and industrial might. Little did I know the real test of those floating fortresses was yet to come, and with it, a revelation that would shake the very foundations of naval strategy. As the fog thickened over Portsmouth, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down a future where the old rules no longer applied. And somewhere out there, beyond sight and sound, the enormous shadow of an American carrier was already changing the tides of war. But what secrets hid beneath its steel decks? What force could challenge an enemy who carried not just weapons, but entire cities on the sea? The answers were waiting in the deep, and I was determined to find them. The war had already changed the coastline of North Africa when I first heard whispers of the American carrier's true power in action. I was stationed near Gibraltar then, watching the busy traffic of convoys threading their way through dangerous waters, when reports reached us of Operation Torch, an Allied invasion of Morocco and Algeria backed by those floating airfields at sea. It was the first time many of us saw just how dramatically these carriers reshaped the battlefield. The Mediterranean, Once thought a confined chessboard where shore-based aircraft and Axis naval forces held sway, suddenly became a hunting ground for American planes launched from the decks of carriers that seemed to appear where least expected. Their presence was like a shadow that stretched over every convoy, every coastal defense. I remember the uneasy conversation with Lieutenant Harris, a wiry man with keen eyes and a quick wit. "They're not just ships anymore, James," he said, lighting a cigarette with shaky fingers. "They're airfields that move with the tide. We can't hide, can't run. Not with those winged fleets overhead." The sights and sounds of those campaigns haunted me. Carrier-based aircraft pounding coastal batteries, strafing supply lines, and escorting landing troops with deadly precision. The Axis forces scrambled to respond, but their shore-based air was no match for the relentless tempo of American sorties. Planes took off in waves, returning to the carrier deck only to be refueled and rearmed before heading back into the fight. It was exhaustion on a scale we hadn't prepared for. On one occasion, I was granted a rare glimpse inside one of these leviathans when a captured American pilot was brought for interrogation at our base. He described the ship as a city afloat, with hangar decks so vast you could lose yourself among the rows of aircraft. His words painted pictures of mechanics working beneath the roaring engines, officers coordinating strikes with an ease that bordered on casual mastery. He spoke of the flight deck's endless stretch, gleaming under the Mediterranean sun, where sailors in colorful jackets darted about like bees in a hive. "It's chaos that works," he said with a grin. "But don't mistake it for disorder." I couldn't help but imagine the scene, the pilot's uniform sharp, his crisp leather boots catching the light, the sheen of sweat on his brow after a long sortie. There was a confidence there, born not just of skill but of the machinery that supported him. Back on land, the news from Sicily only deepened our dread. American carriers had supported the invasion with waves of dive bombers and fighters, neutralizing defenses before the first boots touched the beaches. German and Italian commanders scrambled to mount counterattacks, but the carriers' reach made their efforts futile. The Mediterranean was no longer a safe haven. It was an allied lake, ruled by airfields on water. I remember sitting in a dimly lit room with other officers, poring over captured documents that detailed the scale of American carrier operations. The numbers were staggering. 80, 90, sometimes more than 100 aircraft on a single ship, each capable of striking targets far beyond the horizon. It was a force multiplier unlike anything we had faced before. Yet what struck me most was the psychological toll. Our men, cramped in steel hulls and scant rations, fought against an enemy whose sailors dined on fresh food, enjoyed proper rest, and returned to battle with a resilience that seemed almost unnatural. The carriers were more than weapons. They were symbols of a way of war that emphasized endurance and industrial might. Lieutenant Harris mused aloud one evening, swirling his glass of whiskey. "It's not just the planes or the ships, James. It's the whole damn machine, factories, shipyards, morale. We're fighting shadows and ghosts that keep coming back stronger." The Mediterranean campaigns revealed a truth we could no longer ignore. Battleships and coastal guns were no longer the kings of the sea. The age of the aircraft carrier had dawned, and with it, a new kind of warfare that bent geography and shattered old doctrines. As I watched the sun set over the harbor, its fiery glow reflecting off the calm sea, a chilling thought settled in my mind. If these floating cities could dominate the Mediterranean, what awaited us in the vast, open expanse of the Atlantic? The answer was hidden beyond the horizon, in a war that was still unfolding, and in the steel hearts of those colossal carriers, carrying secrets that could change everything. By the time I was assigned to the Naval Intelligence Unit in Liverpool, the war had shifted focus, and so had my understanding of those floating giants, the American aircraft carriers. The reports coming in from the Pacific theater were something out of a nightmare, yet impossible to look away from. It was a world where the rules we'd clung to were unraveled by waves of planes launched from ships that moved like islands on the ocean. I recall the first briefing vividly. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Officers gathered around a map dotted with red and blue markers, marking the relentless push of American forces across the Pacific. Our intelligence liaison, Commander Wallace, a man whose stern face rarely betrayed emotion, spoke with grim authority. "The Battle of Midway was a turning point," he said. "For Japanese carriers lost in one engagement, sunk by aircraft launched from American carriers hundreds of miles away. It's not just a battle, it's a revolution." I leaned in, absorbing every word. The idea that entire fleets could be crippled without firing a single gun directly at each other was almost surreal. The carriers had transformed naval combat into a deadly game of chess played in the skies, where the pawns were dive bombers and torpedo planes, and the board stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Commander Wallace went on to describe the American carriers themselves. Steel giants nearly 900 feet long, their decks buzzing with the energy of hundreds of aircraft and thousands of sailors. The hangars beneath were bustling workshops, where damaged planes were repaired with astonishing speed, ready to return to the fight before the enemy could even catch their breath. He told us about the crew's efficiency, a seemingly chaotic ballet of men in color-coded uniforms, each performing precise tasks: fueling, arming, directing. The flight decks were alive with motion, launching and recovering planes in a rhythm that defied the chaos of battle. What struck me most was the emphasis on human endurance. Unlike our own cramped and austere ships, American carriers were almost luxurious in comparison. Sailors enjoyed gyms, barbershops, even movie screenings to keep morale high during endless deployments. Commander Wallace joked, "They've got ice cream on board." Ice cream. You can't fight hunger and homesickness with hardtack and canned soup. I smiled, imagining the hardened faces of our own crews, their spirits worn thin by cramped quarters and rationed meals. The Americans had turned warship living into a science of survival and sustainability. It was a lesson harshly learned but hard to ignore. Later, I pored over photographs smuggled from the Pacific, flight decks stretching like endless runways, rows of aircraft meticulously lined up, officers in sharp uniforms coordinating operations like conductors of a symphony. The sheer scale was breathtaking, almost obscene in its grandeur. One image caught my eye: a young female nurse, her crisp white uniform pressed perfectly, a subtle curve to her smile as she tended to wounded sailors. There was a quiet strength in her gaze that spoke volumes about the resilience woven into these floating cities. But beneath the awe lay a deepening dread. The carriers were more than ships. They were mobile airfields capable of striking anywhere, anytime, and then disappearing into the vast ocean. They carried the industrial might of America with them, a power that we in Europe could scarcely match. Our own naval doctrine, built on the glory of battleships and stealthy submarines, suddenly felt obsolete. The war was no longer fought solely by steel and gunpowder but by wings and waves, by speed and endurance. That night, as rain hammered against the windows of the intelligence office, I found myself wondering, how long could we hold out against an enemy who brought the very factories and airfields to the sea? And what new horrors awaited when those floating cities sailed into the Atlantic, casting their enormous shadows over our coasts? The war was evolving, and with it, the future of naval combat. Somewhere far away, those carriers were preparing for the next move in a game we were only beginning to understand. And in their steel hearts, secrets waited, secrets that could tip the balance of power and determine the fate of nations. The hum of activity aboard the American carrier I was forced to board as a prisoner still echoes in my mind. An experience so surreal it felt like stepping into another world entirely. My name is James Carter, and after months in the Mediterranean, fate handed me a glimpse behind the iron curtain of those floating fortresses. It was late 1943 when I, along with a handful of other British officers, was transported aboard the USS Independence, a ship that seemed less a war machine and more a sprawling city adrift on the ocean. From the moment I set foot on the flight deck, I was struck by the contrast to anything I'd known. The deck stretched endlessly, polished and humming with the energy of hundreds of sailors in brightly colored jerseys. Yellow for plane handlers, red for ordnance crews, green for catapult operators. A chaotic symphony of purpose. The roar of engines, the smell of aviation fuel, and the clatter of boots created a pulse that never seemed to slow. Below deck, the hangar was cavernous, housing dozens of aircraft lined up like soldiers ready for battle. Mechanics worked tirelessly, their grease-streaked faces focused yet somehow relaxed, confident in their craft. I couldn't help but notice how the air was filled with a strange mixture of oil, sweat, and something almost like hope, a stark contrast to the oppressive steel confines of our own vessels. The living quarters were astonishing. Where we endured cramped bunks stacked like coffins, the Americans enjoyed cabins that, while still Spartan, offered space and light. The mess halls were enormous, tables groaning under the weight of fresh bread, vegetables, and even desserts. I caught one young sailor, barely out of his teens, grinning as he savored a scoop of vanilla ice cream. I joked with him, "You lads eat better than us on shore leave." He laughed, "Better eat up now, sir. We're going to need the strength." I was escorted to the officers' quarters, where I found a group of American officers relaxing in shirt sleeves, their demeanor surprisingly casual given the circumstances. One of them, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, wore a crisp uniform that clung to his lean frame, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms marked by faint scars, a testament to the brutal reality beneath the polished surface. He spoke candidly about the carrier's operations, describing the relentless pace of sorties, the precision required to launch and recover dozens of aircraft daily, and the seamless coordination between aircrews, mechanics, and deckhands. "It's like a well-oiled machine," he said, smiling wryly. "Except the oil is aviation fuel, and the machine's roaring to keep us alive." What struck me most was their confidence. Not arrogance, but a steadfast belief in their ship, their mission, and each other. They seemed to embody a spirit that transcended the metal and machinery, a community bound by purpose and endurance. Later, I was allowed to wander the corridors, where I glimpsed a barber trimming a sailor's hair, a small gym where others lifted weights or sparred softly, and a makeshift cinema where a black and white film played to an audience of tired but entertained men. It was a life of war, yes, but one infused with moments of humanity and respite. I couldn't help but contrast this with the grim reality of our own vessels, the cramped quarters, the rationed food, the constant tension. The Americans had engineered not just a ship, but a home, a fortress of steel and spirit that sustained thousands through the relentless grind of war. As I stood on the flight deck watching planes take off into the gray sky, I realized that this floating city was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of a new kind of warfare, one that combined industrial might, human resilience, and technological innovation in a way we had yet to match. And yet, beneath the surface of this marvel lay questions I dared not voice aloud. How could we hope to counter a force so vast, so self-sustaining? What secrets did these carriers hold? Secrets that might one day decide the fate of the oceans, and perhaps the world itself. The answers were hidden somewhere in the endless decks and roaring engines, waiting for the next wave of conflict to reveal them. The war had dragged on, and as I found myself reassigned to a small coastal command in Devon, the tension in the air was almost tangible. The Atlantic was no longer just a vast expanse of water. It had become a battleground dominated by shadows and steel, with the American carriers casting their long, dark silhouettes over every convoy route. The reports kept coming. New Essex-class carriers launching from American shipyards as fast as the blueprints could be drawn, each one larger and more formidable than the last. One evening, as twilight bled into night, I sat on the weather-beaten dock with Lieutenant Collins, a sharp-eyed veteran who had seen more than his share of convoy escorts. He was a lean man, his uniform rumpled but his bearing unmistakably naval. As we watched the horizon where the lights of distant ships twinkled like stars, he muttered, "They're endless, James. These floating cities. They build them as if they were nothing more than merchant ships." I nodded, recalling the intelligence reports that had left us all shaken. Unlike our own painstakingly built battleships, which took years and precious resources to complete, the Americans churned out carriers in months. Their shipyards thrummed with life, steel plates bending and welding beneath cranes that resembled giants' arms. It was industrial power on a scale that defied belief. Collins leaned closer, voice dropping. "And it's not just the ships. It's what's inside them. Aircraft, fuel, workshops, medical facilities. They've packed everything needed for war into these floating fortresses. They don't need to dock for weeks. maybe months. The sheer autonomy was staggering. Where our vessels depended on vulnerable supply lines and distant ports, these carriers carried their own lifeblood. Fuel for planes, spare parts, food, and even gyms and cinemas to keep the men's spirits up. I thought back to the American sailor I'd met months before, savoring ice cream as if it were a small victory against the endless grind of war. We talked long into the night about the psychological edge this gave the Americans. A crew well-fed and rested fought differently than one stretched thin by rationing and cramped quarters. It was a subtle advantage, but in war, subtlety often made the difference between life and death. Then there was the tactical nightmare these carriers posed. With their wings of aircraft, they could strike targets hundreds of miles away, scout enemy submarines before they surfaced, and protect convoys with a shield of fighters that seemed almost invisible until it was too late. Collins shook his head. We've built our doctrine around big guns and stealthy submarines. Now, we face something that changes the entire chessboard. These carriers bend geography. There's no safe harbor, no hidden convoy. As dawn broke, painting the sky with pale pinks and golds, I felt a chill beyond the morning air. The war was no longer about battleships duking it out under cannon smoke. It was about floating cities with wings, moving swiftly and relentlessly across the seas. And yet, despite all we knew, one question gnawed at me. How long before those carriers sailed into the Atlantic in overwhelming numbers? How long before they turned our own waters into a battleground we could no longer control? The answer was lost somewhere beyond the horizon, in the roar of engines and the endless dance of planes taking off and landing on decks as vast as towns. The future of naval warfare was already sailing toward us, and with it, a storm that threatened to change everything. The evening air was thick with salt and smoke as I stood on the cliffs overlooking the English Channel, the dark waves crashing relentlessly against the rocks below. It was late 1944, and the war had reached a fever pitch. Rumors swirled of massive American carrier task forces preparing to cross into European waters, their decks bristling with hundreds of aircraft ready to unleash destruction. I was Lieutenant James Carter now, a man who had witnessed the slow unraveling of old naval doctrines and the rise of a terrifying new power. That night, I met with Commander Thompson, an intelligence officer whose reputation for sharp insight was matched only by his quiet intensity. He was a tall man, his uniform impeccable despite the weeks of constant operations. As we watched the horizon, he spoke in low tones. The carriers are no longer just a threat out there in the Pacific or Mediterranean. They're coming here. We've intercepted orders, squadrons assembling, ready to turn the Atlantic into their hunting ground. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The thought of those floating cities, each carrying the firepower of an entire airfield, slipping into our waters was almost too much to bear. How many? I asked, voice barely above a whisper. Too many to count, Thompson replied grimly. And they'll bring with them a storm we can't weather with battleships or U-boats alone. He went on to describe the American industrial machine that had made this possible, the relentless production lines pumping out carriers and aircraft at a pace that left our own shipyards struggling to keep up. Each carrier was a fortress, but also a symbol of a nation mobilized for total war, where every factory, every worker, and every sailor played a part in an unstoppable force. I thought back to the stories I'd heard of the carrier's inner life. The sprawling mess halls where thousands dined on fresh food. The gyms where men fought off the boredom and strain of long voyages. The cinemas projecting flickering images that offered brief escapes from the harsh realities of battle. It was a world built not just for war, but for endurance. Suddenly, a flash of light streaked across the dark sky. A distant flare, signaling an incoming convoy. Thompson's eyes narrowed. They know we're watching and they're sending a message. The carrier's reach is closer than we think. As the night deepened, I felt the weight of history pressing down. The age of the battleship was ending, replaced by these floating cities of steel and wings. The seas we had known were changing, and with them the fate of nations. But amid the fear and uncertainty, a question lingered in my mind. A secret whispered among the corridors of power, yet never fully answered. What was the true extent of the power these carriers held? What hidden capabilities lay beneath their decks? waiting to be unleashed. The answer, I knew, would come in the next clash, an encounter that would decide not just the control of the seas, but the destiny of the world itself. And as the first planes of a new dawn prepared to take flight, I realized that the greatest battle was yet to come. The chill of early morning bit through my coat as I stood on the deck of HMS Vigilant, watching the horizon where the sun was just beginning to bleed into the sky. The air smelled of salt and diesel, and the steady thrum of engines filled the ship's belly. We had received word that a massive American carrier group was making its way toward the Atlantic convoy routes, a force unlike anything we had ever faced. I was Lieutenant James Carter, now part of the escort fleet tasked with defending vital supply lines that kept Britain's heart beating. The tension on board was palpable. Sailors moved with a nervous energy, their faces etched with fatigue, but eyes sharp with determination. The officers' mess was hushed. Even the usual banter felt muted under the weight of what was to come. As the hours passed, the lookout's cry shattered the stillness. Aircraft sighted, starboard bow. The sky erupted with specks that quickly grew into the unmistakable shapes of American Hellcats and Corsairs, their sleek forms cutting through the dawn. Our fleet braced for the inevitable. But what struck me most was the efficiency with which the American crews launched wave after wave of aircraft from their floating cities. Planes took off in rapid succession, disappearing over the horizon, only to return minutes later with deadly payloads. The flight deck was a hive of activity, sailors in colored jerseys darting about like bees, fueling, arming, and directing with practiced ease. I caught a glimpse of a young American pilot as he climbed into his cockpit. His uniform immaculate, helmet gleaming, a confident smile playing at the corner of his mouth. His eyes met mine briefly, and for a moment, I saw not an enemy but a man caught in the same storm of war. The battle that followed was unlike any I'd experienced. Our traditional defenses felt inadequate against the relentless air assaults. Dive bombers struck with precision, crippling ships before they could respond, while fighters patrolled the skies, cutting down our own aircraft as they scrambled to defend. Despite our efforts, the scale and speed of the American carrier operations overwhelmed us. Each time we thought we had repelled one wave, another surged forward, relentless and unyielding. The sea itself seemed to churn with the fury of this new kind of warfare. Amid the chaos, I found myself reflecting on the transformation of naval combat. The age of battleships, with their thunderous guns and armored hulls, was giving way to a dominion of flight decks and squadrons, floating cities projecting power far beyond their steel sides. As dusk settled, the surviving ships regrouped, battered but unbroken. Yet the cost was clear. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. That night, as I wrote in my journal by the flickering light of a lantern, a question gnawed at me. What secrets did these carriers conceal beyond their aircraft and guns? What innovations lay hidden in their steel hearts that made them not just ships, but empires afloat? The answer eluded me, but I knew one thing with certainty. The future of naval warfare had arrived, and it was airborne, swift, and unstoppable. And somewhere beneath the roar of engines and the glow of deck lights, the next chapter of this deadly dance was already unfolding. The cold bite of winter settled over Portsmouth as I returned from another exhausting patrol. The docks were alive with activity, ships coming and going, crews sharing weary smiles and bitter news. Yet beneath the surface of this familiar hustle, a palpable tension lingered. The war was no longer just a contest of steel and cannon. It had become a battle of endurance, innovation, and shadowed strategies. And at the heart of this transformation were the American aircraft carriers. I found myself in the officers' club, nursing a glass of whiskey, when Captain Reynolds approached. His face was lined with fatigue, but his eyes held a spark of something deeper. Concern, perhaps, or revelation. "James," he said quietly, "we've intercepted new intelligence. The Americans aren't just building carriers faster, they're evolving them. Secret modifications, advanced radar systems, new fighter designs. They're turning these floating cities into almost unstoppable war machines." I leaned in, the weight of his words sinking in. "Unstoppable." He nodded grimly. "They're integrating technology we've barely begun to understand. radar that extends their sight beyond what anyone imagined, fighters faster and more agile, and systems to launch and recover aircraft with even greater speed. It's a revolution in warfighting. The room seemed to close in around me as I considered the implications. Our own Navy, proud and tradition-bound, was scrambling to keep pace with a foe that combined industrial might, technological innovation, and a relentless drive that seemed impossible to match. Later that night, I wandered the empty docks, the sea whispering secrets beneath the moonlight. I thought about the young sailor I'd met aboard the USS Independence, the pilot with the confident smile and unwavering spirit. What drove these men? Was it just duty, or a belief in something larger? An unspoken promise that their floating cities were not just instruments of war, but symbols of a future crafted by human ingenuity and resilience? As I stared out across the dark waters, a distant rumble echoed, a reminder that despite the advances, the sea remained a battleground where fortunes could shift with the turn of a tide. But beneath the surface, a deeper mystery lingered. What new weapons and strategies lay hidden within those massive carriers? What secrets had the Americans woven into their steel and circuitry that we had yet to uncover? The war was entering a new phase, one defined not just by battles, but by secrets and shadows. And as the night deepened, I knew that the coming days would demand more than courage. They would require us to unravel the enigma of the floating cities before they wrote the final chapter of this deadly conflict. The dawn broke cold and gray over the English Channel, casting long shadows across the restless sea. I stood on the bridge of HMS Resolute, the weight of the past years pressing heavily on my shoulders. The war had changed beyond recognition, and so had I. The floating cities of the Americans, the great aircraft carriers, had become the defining force of naval warfare, their very presence rewriting the rules we once held sacred. Reports had come in overnight of a massive carrier task force approaching the Atlantic convoy routes. The Admiralty was mobilizing every available ship to meet this new threat. As I watched the horizon, a low rumble of engines stirred the air, the distant roar of aircraft taking flight from those steel behemoths, carriers that seemed less like ships and more like empires adrift on the waves. I thought back to all I had witnessed. The sprawling hangars filled with sleek aircraft, the endless flight decks alive with motion and purpose, the men who lived and fought within these floating cities with a resilience that defied imagination. I remembered the stewardess with the subtle curves beneath her navy blue dress, the sharp-eyed pilots whose confident smiles masked the danger they faced, and the engineers who kept this vast machine humming with tireless devotion. But beneath all that grandeur lay a deeper truth, a revolution born not just of steel and wings, but of vision and will. The Americans had built more than ships. They had built a new way of war, one that fused technology, industry, and human spirit into an unstoppable force. As the first waves of aircraft appeared on the horizon, their engines screaming like thunder, I felt a cold certainty settle within me. The age of battleships and old doctrines was over. The future belonged to these floating cities, to the carriers that carried not just planes, but the very fate of nations. Yet amid this certainty, a question lingered, a whisper carried on the salt air. What secrets remained hidden deep within those colossal decks? What new weapons, what untold strategies, lay waiting to be unleashed in the next chapter of this deadly conflict? The answer was out there, beyond the horizon, in the roar of engines and the flash of gunfire. And as the battle for the seas began anew, I knew this was only the beginning. The war had entered a new dimension, and the floating cities were its kings. But the true test, the one that would decide the fate of the world, was still to come.